This is The Critical Thinker, episode 16. Hey everyone, thanks for tuning in for another episode of the Critical Thinker podcast, the podcast dedicated to helping you understand what it means to be an independent critical thinker. I am your host, Kevin Delaplante. You can find show notes to the podcast episodes at www.criticalthinkeracademy.com, where I also host a membership site where you can subscribe and gain access to over 12 hours of video tutorials on various aspects of logic, argumentation, critical reasoning, and argumentative essay writing. On this episode of the podcast, I'll be introducing a topic that will occupy us for the next few episodes. In fact, we're going to be talking about critical thinking about conspiracies. Now, why do I want to stretch this topic over a few episodes? Am I obsessed with conspiracy theories? No. Here's the deal. As I was preparing for the episode, I realized there really was a lot of material that I wanted to cover. And I've also wanted to go back into doing shorter episodes that come up more frequently. I'm also trying to integrate the video podcast episodes into the tutorial courses that I offer on the Critical Thinker Academy site. And it's just easier to have shorter episodes organized around a single theme or a couple of themes. I also realized while writing the episodes that I'm actually using this as a case study to introduce some other important critical thinking concepts, like the concept of falsifiability and some other interesting cognitive biases. And I don't want all of this to get lost in a 1-hour episode that'll be a chore to sit through. So these are the reasons for splitting up the topic into several shorter episodes. In this episode, I'm going to start off with a basic introduction to the topic. What is a conspiracy theory? And why is the topic interesting from a critical thinking standpoint? Okay, what is a conspiracy theory? Well, in a nutshell, a conspiracy theory is a theory that purports to explain an historical event or a series of historical events by appealing to a conspiracy of some kind. So, what's a conspiracy? Well, minimally, to have a conspiracy, you need to have a group of people. You can't conspire all by yourself. And that group of people makes plans and acts in secrecy, hidden from public view. Secrecy is an essential feature of conspiracies. Now, by this definition, there doesn't have to be anything sinister to make something a conspiracy. On this definition, when we plan a surprise birthday party for a friend, we're engaged in conspiracy. When we work at keeping the magic of Santa Claus alive for our kids, we're actively promoting and maintaining a conspiracy. But in the sense in which the term conspiracy theory is normally used in political contexts, there's an assumption that the conspirators have sinister or at least objectionable aims of some kind. To engineer events and control public perception, to acquire money and power and influence and so on. It's probably a mistake to build this into the definition of a conspiracy, but in the cases that we'll be looking at, the label conspiracy usually comes with a normative judgment that there's something objectionable about the aims of the conspirators. Also, a conspiracy explanation of some historical event is usually contrasted with other explanations that have official status at the time and place in question. For example, the official explanation of the collapse of the Twin Towers at the World Trade Center on 9/11 is that it was the result of a surprise attack involving 2 hijacked planes that were flown into the towers. 9/11 conspiracy theories challenge this official story. Most popular claim is that the U.S. government knew about the planned attacks and let them happen, and that the government may even have helped engineer the collapse by rigging the buildings with explosives to ensure that they fell when the planes hit them. So you've got the official explanation, and you've got an alternative explanation which involves a conspiracy among various parties, including the U.S. government, to stage the event and a conspiracy to cover up the government's involvement in the event. This gives a nice example of the kinds of theories that we're talking about. Another good example is the moon landing conspiracy theories, which claim that the first moon landings were faked. The idea is that during the 1960s, the U.S. was in a race with the Soviet Union to develop space technology and be the first to land on the moon. But the moon landing turned out to be impossible. It was technologically too challenging. The political cost of this failure was perceived as too high, so the government, or NASA, or both, decided to fake the 1969 moon landing on a soundstage. The rocket was launched, but it re-entered the atmosphere soon after the launch and was ditched in the ocean. The actual moon landing pictures and video were faked in a studio. Now, the argument that conspiracy theorists make is that there are lots of anomalies in the photographs and videos that are hard to explain if they were actually taken on the moon, where there's no atmosphere and only one dominant light source, but could easily be explained if they'd been shot on a soundstage. So once again, we've got an official version of the story and we've got an alternative version of the story that invokes a conspiracy. Now, conspiracy theories come in different scales, depending on the size and extent of the conspiracy, both in space and in time. The moon landing hoax conspiracy is fairly narrow in scope since it's targeted at a specific historical event. But the conspiracy to cover up the hoax wouldn't necessarily have a long reach in time, getting on now close to 45 years since the event in question. But this is still small compared to what are sometimes called global or grand conspiracy theories. Global conspiracies involve conspiracies among agents and institutions that stretch across the globe and that have influence in almost all aspects of modern life: governments, media, multinational corporations, religious institutions, and so on. In terms of timescales, they can extend over decades or centuries or even millennia. Now, among global conspiracy theories, the most prominent are so-called New World Order theories. Now, this term doesn't pick out a single theory. It's really an umbrella term for a bunch of different theories that share a set of core beliefs. The basic core belief is that there exists a secretive power elite that is conspiring to eventually rule the world through a single world government that will replace sovereign nation-states. This group operates in secret, but has enormous influence through a wide network of public internationalist organizations that themselves have ties to the higher-level organization. Now, among conspiracy theorists, the list of front groups and institutions changes depending on who you ask. But the names of institutions that you commonly hear include the U.S. Federal Reserve, the League of Nations, the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, the UN, the World Health Organization, the European Union, the World Trade Organization, and so on. The agendas of these international institutions are established in secret meetings associated with elite figures and international power brokers like the Bilderberg Group, the Council on Foreign Affairs, the Trilateral Commission, and so on. Because these institutions have so much power and influence, New World Order theorists are disposed to see almost all of the major geopolitical events of the 20th and 21st century, including all the major wars, as the product of an orchestrated plan to eventually bring about a single world government that, while publicly espousing ideals of international citizenship and global community, would in fact exert a totalitarian control that strips away individual liberties. Now, these kinds of New World Order theories are popular among certain libertarian and conservative Christian groups. They're also increasingly popular among New Age thinkers on both the far right and the far left. These groups vary in their views of the actual identities and ultimate motivations of the secret elite, but structurally they have a lot in common. Okay, this gives us some idea of what we're talking about when we talk about conspiracy theories. I think you'll agree that the topic is fascinating in its own right. But why is this topic interesting from a critical thinking perspective? Well, I think there are some obvious reasons why they're interesting, and some not so obvious reasons. Obvious reason number one: belief in conspiracy theories of one form or another is very widespread among the general public, and has become increasingly so over the past 20 years. Surveys indicate, for example, that a sizable minority of the general population believes that George Bush and/or the CIA knew about the September 11 attacks in advance, but intentionally did nothing to prevent them, while a smaller, but still not insignificant proportion believes the U.S. government actually had a hand in orchestrating the attacks, with the express intent of using the attacks as a pretext for launching a global war on terror and justifying military incursions into the Middle East. So the widespread belief in conspiracies of one form or another is an interesting phenomenon by itself. A natural question to ask is, are there good reasons to believe any of these conspiracy theories? What attitude should we as critical thinkers have toward these theories? This leads to obvious reason number two. Among philosophers, and indeed I think most mainstream academics, the most common attitude is a default skepticism about conspiracy theories of this sort. Among professional skeptics who advocate for scientific rationality, it's mostly taken for granted that belief in conspiracies is unjustified and irrational. Not all conspiracies, obviously, but the big conspiracies like the moon hoax or the intentional demolition of the Twin Towers by the US government, or global conspiracy theories that posit a small secret elite is engineering world events, these are viewed by most academics, not all but most, as fundamentally implausible, if not outright delusional. Now, if this is right, then a question to ask is, how exactly is this default skepticism justified? Are there good reasons to adopt this view? Well, one of the things I'm going to do in the episodes to come is to run through what I take to be the main arguments for default skepticism about conspiracy theories. I'll leave it to you listeners to decide whether you think they're good arguments. Now, there's another reason why conspiracy theories are interesting from a critical thinking perspective. This one not so obvious. It has to do with the attitude that conspiracy theorists have toward critical thinking itself, and I find it both ironic and absolutely fascinating. It turns out that many people who endorse conspiracy theories are also passionate advocates for critical thinking education. They promote the teaching of logic and argumentation skills. They want us to understand informal fallacies and the difference between justified and unjustified beliefs. I know this because I receive emails from people on both the right and the left who say they're admirers of the podcast, they love what I'm doing, they want to spread the word about the importance of critical thinking, and who follow up with, oh, by the way, have you looked at this website? I think you might find it interesting. And the website they refer me to is associated with some socio-political movement that is predicated on a conspiracy theory of some kind. And it turns out, for some of these groups, the more global and all-encompassing the posited conspiracy is, the more importance they place on logic and critical thinking skills. And what's fascinating, and like I said, ironic, is that this runs exactly counter to what, for lack of a better term, I'll call the establishment view of conspiracies and critical thinking, which is that the more global and all-encompassing the conspiracy is, the less plausible it is, and the more irrational it is to believe it. Now let me just pause and elaborate a bit about this last point, because I think I understand what's going on in the minds of conspiracy theorists, and I think it's interesting. For a conspiracy theorist to identify a conspiracy, you need to be able to see beyond and behind the official story, which by hypothesis will be a misrepresentation of reality, a tissue of facts, half-truths, and outright deceptions that is designed to hide the truth. Seeing past the lies and deceptions requires the ability to identify inconsistencies in the official story, follow sometimes long chains of inferences, and identify fallacies and techniques of intentional deception. Hence, identifying a conspiracy, seeing it for what it is an act of successful critical thinking. That's the way conspiracy theorists see it. And the more broad and encompassing the conspiracy, the greater the challenge for critical thinking, requiring even more vigilance and more rigor in our thinking. Now, what makes the identification of conspiracies even harder still, and I've learned that this is a widely shared view, especially among New World Order theorists, is that one of the techniques that the powerful elite have used to maintain control is by a deliberate program of dumbing down the general public, by suppressing the development of critical thinking capacities among the unwashed masses. They'll point to the distractions of Hollywood, of professional sports, or music and video games as tools for keeping us distracted and entertained. They'll point to the systematic elimination of critical thinking education from the public school curriculum. For example, classical liberal arts education used to be structured around 3 core disciplines that constituted what was called the trivium, which included grammar, logic, and rhetoric. This core was part of a basic instruction in how to think, how to learn, and how to communicate one's understanding of a given subject matter. Now, this material isn't generally taught in public schools anymore, and they'll ask, why not? Here's why not, they'll say. The purposes of public schooling have been subordinated to the purposes of the elite ruling classes, which require citizens who are conformist, obedient, dependent on external guidance and direction, intellectually incurious, and easily controlled. We can't have the unwashed masses going around thinking for themselves and criticizing the status quo. That's not part of the elite game plan. So, critical thinking education for the general public becomes important on this view because its suppression has been instrumental in maintaining and perpetuating the conspiracy. So it follows then that if the goal is to unmask the conspiracy and free people's minds to see reality as it truly is, then we need to promote critical thinking skills and make critical thinking resources more available to the general public. And that, in a nutshell, is why so many conspiracy proponents are also strong advocates of critical thinking education. And you can see why someone in my position would find this view both attractive and ironic at the same time. It's a very romantic vision of the critical thinker as an anti-establishment culture warrior whose special knowledge and skills can help us to see behind the veil of appearances, free our minds, and begin to live a life outside the matrix, as it were. I love this. It makes me feel like Morpheus. And yet, at the same time, my skeptic friends view these sorts of grand conspiracy theories as classic examples of irrational and misguided belief. They see a call for critical thinking education from these people as bizarrely ironic as astrologers or flat earthers advocating for better science education in the public schools. Okay, that wraps up my introduction to this topic. I hope I've convinced you to stick around for the next few episodes, where we'll take a closer look at some of the more common arguments for default skepticism about conspiracy theories. Let me also say that I will have a few critical things to say about these arguments, so hold off on your judgment about my own views until we're finished this series. I invite you all to visit the Academy site at www.criticalthinkeracademy.com to leave comments and see the show notes for this episode. You can check out the offerings in the Academy and register for our free monthly newsletter too. So thanks again, and we'll see you next time.